A Simplex converted to a Great Western Railway Prairie tank, part 28, fitting the superheater element and making an improved version of the Petticoat Pipe. The wet header end of the superheater element is mounted to the flange using 4 temporary 2BA bolts. This is at the other end, and I'm tightening the nut that holds the steam union onto the steam inlet pipe. I discovered that the union nut was not a good fit on the steam inlet pipe. And to make matters worse, when I fit the blast nozzle, I have to move the steam inlet pipe out of the way. This blast nozzle is unnecessarily large, because it was at one time also a blower. In this closer look you can see where the pipe inlet's been chopped off. Initially I fitted it into the lathe chuck and tried to turn it down, but that wasn't a practical solution. So I'm going to make a new, longer one that fits. That's not really what this episode's about. Here is the Petticoat Pipe, and its function is to focus the exhaust blast of steam from the blast nozzle that I'm going to replace. This one is rubbish though. The flare is insufficient and it's very badly made. It's just a piece of copper tubing that's been assaulted with a hammer to make it flare somewhat. Even the mounting lugs are not really in the right place, but I'm not bothered about this because I can reprofile them. All I'm going to do is chop off the end of this piece of copper pipe where it all goes wrong. And then I'm going to make a new petticoat pipe from some of this brass bar. This will be much better. The petticoat pipe will be removable, so I won't have to remove the chimney to get spanner access that will eventually secure the wet header to the flange. Once I cut off the part that I didn't want, I fitted the rest of it in the lathe chuck. What I'm currently doing is cleaning up the end of the copper tube. I'd like to just mention cleaning up the end of copper tubes in a lathe. Copper is a very soft metal, and for holding copper tubing when machining, a 3-jaw chuck is not ideal. A chuck with many more jaws would be a lot better, but I don't know of many beginners who have any of those. So I'm doing it using a small 3-jaw chuck. Warning, if you take a large cut you will destroy the part. So it's a lot of very fine cuts, and generally speaking I would turn away from the chuck, and I'm doing most of the cutting with the tool on its way back. Once I got the edge of the tube square, I cleaned up the inside using a deburring tool and the outside using a file. Over now to the workbench to take some measurements. The part of the tube that I cut off using the bandsaw was 7/8 of an inch long. So now using this piece of brass I need to make a special part that fits over the tube that is 1 3/8 of an inch long. And to do this I'm using my very old metal cutting bandsaw. What can I say about this metal cutting bandsaw? It's a really horrible old thing, but it works okay, just like a girlfriend I once had. No, that's a bit unfair. The girlfriend was truly horrible, and she didn't even know how to use a hacksaw. By heavily editing the video, as you can see, in no time at all the blade went through the piece of brass. Back over now to the lathe. The piece of brass is in the chuck and I've speeded everything up. What I'm doing here is levelling off the end. This piece of brass was cut originally on my bandsaw when it was very out of adjustment and it didn't cut straight. So now I'm straightening it up. By using quite a lot of cuts as I've just shown, eventually I could face off in the normal manner. Here you can see that the tool is a bit low, so I'll quickly adjust it and take another facing cut. That's better, the tool is exactly on centre height now. The next part of the job is to turn down the piece of brass to be bigger than the copper tube, but not too big. Because I don't want it to look big and thick and ugly. You can insert your own girlfriend joke there. I want it to look rather attractive when it's in the smoke box. I took a series of cuts until the end part of the brass was the right size. When I held the copper tube up against it, it showed me how large I needed the part to be. This next sequence is not easy to do. I've changed the tool from my normal knife tool to a round nose tool. But before I did that, I started to shape the part using the knife tool. This is the clever bit. I have auto traverse engaged, and I have my hand on the cross slide handle. At a certain point, I slowly start winding out the cross slide handle, winding the handle first quite fast and then slowing it down to achieve a bell type shape. At this stage I'm just checking that it's the correct length, using the part that I cut off. Now it's time for a drilling extravaganza, starting off with the centre drill, followed by a succession of different drill bits to enlarge the hole before I bore it to the correct size. I'm not going all the way through the piece of brass, just past the part that I turned previously. Now I have a much larger drill bit fitted, and this is one that goes into the Morse taper of the quill on the tailstock. And finally I'm putting a 1-inch drill bit through. You will notice there's a felt tip pen on this drill bit, which is not new, it's been on there for a long time. I do this a lot, it saves reading numbers on the lathe. I don't have an aversion to numbers much these days, just my eyesight is not as good as it once was. I really do need to get my eyes tested, I think. The next part of this video is quite boring, literally. I've fitted a boring tool into the tool post and I'm enlarging the hole down the centre of the piece of brass. This is somewhere near. Now it's time to take very fine cuts because I do not want this to be oversized. It needs to be a firm push fit on the original piece of copper tubing. I do this by taking a fine test cut, then trying the copper tube in place. And once the original piece of copper tube is a good fit in the test part, complete the cut all the way down. With each of the test cuts, I use the boring tool going towards the chuck and then also back again. And that's what I'm doing now all the way down. By boring the hole with the boring bar, what I normally do is reverse the direction of it without touching any of the hand wheels. And then the boring bar takes a very fine cut, and hopefully this should fit the copper tubing fine. The final part of the job is to use the boring bar as a facing tool and pull it towards me. After cleaning away all of the swarf, the copper tube now fits into the hole perfectly. The final part of this sequence is the parting off operation. I don't need the rest of the piece of brass, just the fancy end bit. In this sequence I've locked the saddle in position so it can't go forward or backwards, and I've rotated the top slide so it's at an angle to the work, and what I'm doing here is just operating the top slide handle to push the boring bar in and out of the work, and this more or less follows the same angle that I cut freehand on the outside of the work. All I need to do now is clean up the outside with a file, and here I'm cleaning the inside edge using a piece of 100 grit emery cloth. The emery cloth is folded over and my fingers are actually nowhere near the rotating part. Here's the finished component. I think it looks a bit better than the original. I chamfered the inside edge of the copper tube to make it match. I haven't decided how to attach this part to the copper tube, but I've got one or two good ideas that I'll feature in a later episode. But that's it for this episode. I'd just like to say, stay healthy, thanks for watching, and I hope you found it useful. Please take the time to visit my Mainsteam Models website and click on the section of the website that says Video Playlists. And by doing that, you can find other videos that you may like to watch. And by using the playlists, you can actually watch the videos back to back.